The fog clung to the ground like a shroud, wrapping the twisted oaks in a veil that muffled every sound except the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Elena drove her rented car up the narrow, winding road, the headlights cutting weak beams through the gathering dusk. The estate loomed ahead, a forgotten relic from another era, its stone walls overgrown with ivy that seemed to pulse like veins in the dim light. She'd come here on a whim, really, or so she told herself after the lawyer's letter arrived, informing her of an inheritance from a distant relative she never knew existed. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharper, like decay just beneath the surface. She parked and stepped out, the chill seeping through her coat as she fumbled for the keys. The house was silent, too silent, as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the rooms were filled with dust-covered furniture, portraits of stern-faced ancestors staring down with eyes that followed her every move. That first night, as she lay in the creaking bed, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. And then, faintly at first, came the voices, whispers threading through the darkness, words she couldn't quite make out, but they carried a weight, a desperation that made her skin crawl. She sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. Was it the trees? The house settling? Or something older, buried deep in the woods that bordered the property, calling out from the shadows? By morning, the whispers had faded, but the unease lingered like a bad dream. Elena shook it off, attributing it to jet lag and the isolation. She spent the day unpacking, exploring the attic where boxes of yellowed papers hinted at family histories long obscured. One document caught her eye, a faded genealogy chart, branches twisting inward upon themselves, names repeating in a pattern that any geneticist would recognize as dangerous. Habsburg, it whispered in her mind, though the name wasn't written there. She laughed it off, but as twilight fell again, the woods seemed to draw closer, their branches reaching like fingers toward the house. And the voices returned, clearer now, murmuring secrets that begged to be unearthed. The inheritance came out of nowhere, a crisp envelope delivered to Elena's university office in Boston on a grey November afternoon. Inside was a formal letter from an Austrian law firm, written in meticulous German and English, informing her that she was the sole beneficiary of a remote estate in the Alps near the border of Lower Austria and Styria. The deceased was a great-aunt twice removed, someone Elena had never heard mentioned in family conversations, named Margarethe von Hohenberg. No living relatives contested the will. The property had sat empty for decades, maintained only by a local caretaker paid from a dwindling trust. Elena Voss was 34, a rising star in population genetics with a focus on historical consanguinity patterns. She had built her reputation studying the genetic legacy of European royal houses, publishing papers that mapped the devastating effects of centuries of cousin marriages across dynasties. The Habsburgs, in particular, fascinated her, their mandibular prognathism, fertility issues, and eventual extinction of the Spanish line all traceable to relentless inbreeding. She had spent years analyzing DNA from museum samples and archival hairlocks, piecing together pedigrees that looked less like family trees and more like tangled knots. The offer of an actual estate tied to old European aristocracy should have thrilled her professional curiosity, but the timing felt oddly personal. Her mother had died the previous year, leaving behind only vague stories of displaced ancestors who fled east after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Elena had always assumed the trail ended there. Yet here was proof that a branch of the family had survived, hidden away in rural isolation. She booked a flight for early December, telling colleagues she needed a break after a grueling grant season. In truth, she felt compelled, as if the letter had awakened something dormant. The estate was called Waldschatton, Shadowed Woods, and satellite images showed a sprawling manor half swallowed by dense forest, far from any village. The lawyer warned that the house had no modern heating, unreliable electricity, and no cell signal deeper in the valley. Winter snows often cut off the access road for weeks. As her plane descended into Vienna, Elena stared out at the snow-dusted peaks below, a strange anticipation building in her chest. She rented a sturdy SUV and drove south, the highways giving way to narrower mountain passes lined with fir trees heavy with frost. The final stretch was a single-lane track that wound through woods so thick the afternoon light barely penetrated. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying the scent of pine resin and wet earth. When the manor finally appeared through a break in the trees, It looked less like a house and more like something grown out of the landscape itself, grey stone walls veined with ivy, tall narrow windows staring out like watchful eyes, chimneys silent against the pale sky. The caretaker, an elderly man named Klaus, met her at the iron gates with a ring of old keys. He spoke little, only warning her that the woods were deep and easy to lose oneself in, especially after dark. Elena stepped inside, the heavy door closing behind her with a finality that echoed through empty halls. Dust motes drifted in the weak light filtering through leaded glass. Portraits lined the staircase, pale faces with high foreheads and prominent chins, features that made her breath catch. Somewhere in the silence of the house, surrounded by those ancient trees pressing close, she felt the weight of centuries watching. The first night in Waldschatten felt longer than any Elena had ever known. She had spent the evening trying to bring order to the chaos of the house, lighting a fire in the massive stone hearth, unpacking a few essentials, wiping decades of dust from a small bedroom on the second floor. The caretaker had left her with a stack of split logs, a warning about the unreliable generator, and a thermos of strong coffee before disappearing down the snowy track in his old truck. By 10 o'clock the house was warm enough, the wind had risen, and she told herself she was ready for sleep. She chose the smallest bedroom at the back, the one whose windows faced the dense wall of forest rather than the open valley. The bed was narrow, the mattress firm, the linens smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. Elena lay in the dark listening to the house settle, creaks along the beams, the occasional pop from the dying fire downstairs, the soft ticking of cooling pipes. Outside, the wind moved through the tall firs with a sound like distant surf, steady and rhythmic. She closed her eyes, willing exhaustion to pull her under. Then it came, a thread of sound beneath the wind, so faint she thought it was part of a dream already forming. A murmur, almost like speech, rising and falling in cadence. She opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling's deep shadows. The wind gusted harder, rattling the old window panes, and for a moment the sound vanished. She almost convinced herself it had been nothing. But it returned, clearer now, multiple voices, overlapping, carried on the air as if the trees themselves were speaking. They were soft, fragile, the way voices sound when they travel a great distance. Not words she could grasp, only tones, plaintive, searching, edged with something that made the hairs on her arms rise. Elena sat up slowly, heart beginning to thud. She reached for the bedside lamp, but the switch clicked uselessly. The generator had shut down sometime after midnight, leaving the house in absolute darkness. She pulled the heavy curtains aside and peered out. Moonlight filtered through racing clouds, silvering the snow that blanketed the ground between the manor and the tree line. The forest stood black and impenetrable, branches swaying in slow, deliberate waves. Nothing moved in the open space, no animal, no human shape. Yet the whispers persisted, slipping through the glass as if it weren't there, curling around her like cold fingers. Elena pressed her palms to her ears. The sound dulled but did not stop. It seemed to come from inside her skull now, intimate and insistent. She told herself it was the wind playing tricks, vibrating through loose shingles or old chimneys. Houses this ancient always had their voices. Still, she found herself straining to understand, leaning toward the window as if proximity might clarify the fragments floating past. A particularly strong gust shook the panes, and for an instant the murmurs sharpened into something almost recognizable, an inflection of longing, a repeated syllable that might have been a name. Then the clouds swallowed the moon, plunging everything into blackness, and the voices faded into the ordinary howl of the storm. Elena remained at the window long after, breath fogging the glass, telling herself it was only imagination, only fatigue, only the lonely woods breathing against an empty house. Morning light filtered weakly through the heavy clouds, turning the snow a dull grey as Elena laced her boots and pulled on a thick coat. Sleep had come only in fragments after the unsettling night, and by dawn she felt restless, driven by a need to move, to impose logic on the isolation that pressed against the house. She told herself a walk would clear her head, fresh air, exercise, the simple act of mapping her new surroundings. The forest began just beyond the overgrown garden, a dark wall of fir and beech that seemed to lean inward. A faint path, barely more than a depression in the snow, led from a rusted side gate into the trees. Elena followed it, breath pluming in the frigid air, the crunch of her steps the only sound. Within minutes the manor disappeared behind her, swallowed by trunks so thick they blocked the sky. The woods felt ancient, untouched, the kind of place where centuries could pass unnoticed. She walked for perhaps 20 minutes, deeper than she intended, drawn by the silence and the strange pull of curiosity. Snow sifted from overloaded branches, dusting her shoulders. Then the path widened slightly, revealing a small clearing she had not expected. In its center stood the remnants of a structure, low stone walls half collapsed under ivy and moss, arches broken like teeth, a roof long vanished. It had the proportions of a chapel, intimate and forgotten, no larger than a village schoolroom. Elena stepped closer, heart quickening with the thrill of discovery. The stones were old, weathered to the color of bone, carved with patterns worn almost smooth by time and weather. She brushed snow from a section of wall near what must have been the entrance and paused. There, faintly etched beneath centuries of lichen, was a double-headed eagle, imperial, unmistakable. And beneath it, a shield divided into quarters, one bearing the unmistakable bars of Austria, another a lion that tugged at memory. Habsburg. Not the grand imperial crest of Vienna or Madrid, but a variant, lesser known, perhaps a cadet branch long pruned from official histories. She circled the ruins slowly, boots sinking into drifts that had piled against the walls. Vines had claimed the interior, twisting through empty window frames. At the far end, a raised stone platform suggested an altar, now cracked and tilted. Snow had drifted inside, softening the edges of everything, giving the place a hushed, sepulchral beauty. Elena felt the chill deepen, not from the air but from the sense of intrusion, as if she had stumbled into a grave no one had tended for hundreds of years. She traced the faded crest again with gloved fingers, the stone cold even through wool. Questions crowded her mind. Why build a chapel so far from any road or village, hidden like a secret? Who had worshipped here, and why had they vanished so completely that even local memory seemed to have erased them? The woods pressed close around the clearing, branches interlacing overhead, and for a moment she imagined eyes watching from the shadows between trunks. She shook off the fancy, but the unease lingered, sharp and undeniable, as the weak sunlight glinted off the ancient stone. Elena hesitated at the threshold of the ruined chapel, the snow crunching softly under her boots as she stepped inside. The air within was colder than outside, carrying a damp, mineral scent that clung to the back of the throat. Vines had woven themselves through the broken arches, their leaves long dead but still clinging like skeletal fingers. She moved carefully, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, until she reached the far end where the altar platform rose a few steps above the uneven floor. There, half buried under drifted snow and fallen stone, lay something rectangular and dark. She brushed away the powder with her glove, revealing the lid of a coffin, simple, unadorned oak, blackened by age and moisture, iron straps rusted to near disintegration. It was smaller than she expected, almost childlike in proportion, yet the weight of it suggested otherwise. No inscription marked the wood, no cross or symbol, only faint scratches that might once have been lettering worn away by centuries of neglect. Beside the coffin, wedged between the platform and the wall, protruded the corner of a leather-bound volume. Elena knelt, heart beating faster, and worked it free with careful fingers. The binding was cracked, the pages swollen and foxed, but intact enough to hold together. She opened it beneath the flashlight's glow and saw handwriting in faded brown ink, German, old-fashioned script, the letters tall and angular. The first page bore a date, 1789. Below it, a title in Latin, *Liber Memorabilis de Sororibus Exulibus *, Book of Memory concerning the exiled sisters. She turned the pages gently, the paper brittle as dead leaves. Sketches appeared amid the text, two young women in profile, their faces delicate yet marked by the unmistakable prominence of jaw and lip that haunted so many Habsburg portraits. Notes in the margins detailed marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces, repeated over generations, all justified in frantic, defensive prose as necessary to preserve purity of blood against dilution by common stock. One passage described a hurried flight from Vienna after the death of Maria Theresa, a branch of the family deemed too deformed, too scandalous, to remain at court. They had vanished into the mountains with loyal retainers, carrying relics and secrets, vowing never to mingle again with the outside world. Further entries grew stranger, references to rituals performed in this very chapel to bind the lineage to the land itself, to ensure the voices of ancestors would guide and protect the living. The final pages were frantic, ink blotched as if written by a trembling hand, speaking of sisters sealed away alive to preserve the undiluted essence, their sacrifice hidden even from the family's own chroniclers. The journal ended abruptly, the last line unfinished. Elena closed the book slowly, a chill settling deep in her bones that had nothing to do with the winter air. The coffin lid seemed heavier now in her awareness, its silence oppressive. She shone the light across it again, noting faint seams where it might once have been pried open and resealed. The woods outside Elena returned to the manor as the short winter day bled into twilight, the journal clutched tightly beneath her coat and a small canvas bag slung over her shoulder. The coffin had been heavier than expected, its lid warped but not sealed, yielding to the pry bar she found among the caretaker's tools in the shed. She told herself it was professional necessity, only a fragment, the smallest possible sample, nothing that would disturb the rest. Yet her hands shook as she worked in the failing light, the wind whispering through the ruins like disapproval. She chose a slender bone from the lower leg, exposed where the ancient shroud had rotted away, snapping it free with a sound that echoed too loudly in the empty chapel. The marrow cavity was dry, powdery, the color of old parchment. She sealed the fragment in a sterile vial pulled from her field kit, the kind she used for archival samples back in the lab, then covered the break with snow to hide her intrusion. Guilt flickered, sharp and unwelcome, but curiosity burned hotter, a geneticist's reflex, the need to know overriding every other instinct. Back in the house she locked the doors early, drawn curtains against the pressing dark. The generator hummed fitfully as she set up a makeshift workspace in the dining room, portable sequencer borrowed from the university, laptop, reagents chilled in a cooler of snow. She worked by lamplight, the fire crackling low, extracting DNA with practiced efficiency. The process was delicate, ancient samples degraded easily, but the bone yielded enough intact strands to build a preliminary profile. She fed the data into the software, watching the alignment progress bar crawl across the screen. Hours passed. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick flakes hissing against the windows. Elena sipped cold coffee, eyes fixed on the readout. When the first results appeared, she leaned closer, breath-catching. The haplotype markers were unmistakable, R1b subclades common in Western European aristocracy, mitochondrial line H with distinctive polymorphisms she had mapped herself in published Habsburg studies. But the homozygosity was extreme, long runs of identical alleles far beyond even the most consanguineous Spanish branch. Cousin marriages stacked upon uncle-niece unions, generation after generation, until the genome resembled a hall of mirrors reflecting the same sequences endlessly. She cross-referenced against her private database of historical samples. Matches lit up like warnings: Charles II of Spain, Maria Anna of Neuburg, Leopold I, names tied to the infamous prognathism, the infertility, the melancholy. Yet this profile carried additional anomalies, rare variants clustered in regions linked to sensory processing and circadian rhythm, mutations that should have been lethal but somehow persisted. The inbreeding coefficient approached unity, a statistical impossibility for a living population. Elena sat back, the room suddenly too warm despite the winter night. The journal lay open beside her, its sketches of the sisters staring up with those elongated jaws, eyes wide and knowing. She had taken only a fragment, she reminded herself, a scientific necessity. But the data stared back, intimate as a confession, revealing a bloodline pushed to the very edge of humanity. The snow thickened outside, muffling the world, and somewhere in the walls the house seemed to shift, as if adjusting to the weight of what she had brought inside. That night the generator failed again just after midnight, plunging the manor into a darkness so complete it felt solid. Elena had left the laptop running on battery, the screen's pale glow the only light in the dining room as the final alignment completed. She stared at the results, the numbers refusing to resolve into anything rational. The inbreeding coefficient hovered near 0.45, higher than Charles II's infamous 0.254, higher than anything documented in viable human populations. Entire chromosomes showed near-identical homologs, as if the genome had folded in on itself until distinction blurred. She scrolled through the variant calls, her breath shallow. The expected pathologies were there: compound heterozygotes for recessive disorders that should have manifested as severe deformities, metabolic failures, early death. Yet layered among them were anomalies she could not place: insertions and duplications in non-coding regions, repetitive sequences clustered around genes tied to auditory processing and nocturnal vigilance. The mutations looked almost engineered, preserved against all odds through the bottleneck of relentless consanguinity. Elena cross-checked against the journal sketches, holding the brittle pages close to the screen. The sisters' portraits showed the classic Habsburg traits exaggerated to caricature: lower jaws thrust forward like drawn bows, lips thick and everted, eyes set deep under heavy brows. But the DNA told a stranger story. One set of remains, the smaller, more fragile bones, carried an XX karyotype consistent with female, yet expressed certain Y-linked markers in mosaic form, as if genetic boundaries had begun to dissolve. The other profile suggested accelerated epigenetic aging, telomeres shortened far beyond chronological expectation. She leaned back, the chair creaking in the silent house. Outside, the wind had dropped, leaving an unnatural stillness that amplified every small sound: the tick of cooling wood, the faint drip of melting snow from the eaves. The data implied more than mere royal folly. The deliberate concentration of bloodlines, described in the journal as ritual necessity, had pushed the genome past human limits into something transitional, traits selected not for survival in the physical world but for persistence in another register entirely. A notification chimed softly. The software had flagged structural variants matching no known population database. She clicked through raw reads, watching the sequences align in patterns that repeated with eerie symmetry, almost musical. Certain loci glowed red, high-confidence deviations associated in modern studies with heightened sensitivity to infrasound, to environmental cues beyond normal perception. The kind of adaptations whispered about in fringe literature on haunted sites, on places where boundaries thinned. Elena's mouth went dry. The bone fragment lay on the table beside her, sealed in its vial, innocuous under the laptop's light. She had expected confirmation of historical tragedy, perhaps a poignant footnote to her research on dynastic collapse. Instead, the profile suggested the inbreeding had been purposeful, a centuries-long experiment to forge vessels capable of carrying ancestral presence forward. The deformities were not tragic side effects but markers of success, visible signs that the blood had grown dense enough to hold echoes. She closed the laptop slowly, the room sinking back into darkness. Somewhere in the walls, or perhaps deeper, in the frozen ground beneath the house, something shifted in response to the screen going black. The air grew heavier, charged with the scent of turned earth and old stone. Elena sat motionless, the numbers burned behind her eyes, the unnatural genome now mapped and named and waiting. That night the whispers returned with a vengeance, no longer faint threads beneath the wind but a chorus pressing against the windows like insistent fingers. Elena had dozed fitfully in the chair beside the cold hearth, the laptop long since gone dark, the bone fragment still sealed in its vial on the table. She woke abruptly to silence, no generator hum, no crackle from dying embers, only the weight of the house around her and the voices outside. They were clearer now, layered and overlapping, carried on air so still it felt unnatural. She rose slowly, joints stiff from the chill, and moved to the nearest window. Snow had ceased falling, the forest lay under a thick white blanket, moonless sky pricked with hard stars. The whispers rose from the tree line, threading through the glass in archaic German, syllables rounded and formal, the cadence of courtly speech long dead. She caught fragments: Schwester Blatt beware words repeated like a litany, urgent yet patient, as if time meant nothing to the speakers. Elena pressed her forehead to the cold pane, breath fogging the glass. The voices swelled, pleading, coaxing: beware das Blut, komm zu uns, die Linie muss erhalten bleiben. Preserve the blood, come to us, the line must be kept. The phrases circled, hypnotic, pulling at something deep in her chest. She recognized the dialect now, early New High German laced with Austrian inflections, the language of imperial edicts and private confessionals from centuries past. Her pulse hammered. She stepped back, but the words followed, slipping through cracks in the floorboards, seeping from the walls themselves. They were feminine voices, young and old braided together, edged with sorrow and command. One rose above the others, thin and reedy, repeating a single name that sounded almost like her own: Elizabeth. Eleonora. Elena, the vowels stretching until certainty blurred. She fled upstairs, slamming the bedroom door, piling furniture against it as if wood could block sound. But the whispers pursued, softer now, intimate, curling around her ears like breath. They spoke of promises kept in darkness, of purity maintained through sacrifice, of a lineage too precious to dilute. The plea was unmistakable: join, continue, preserve. The voices promised understanding, belonging, an end to the isolation that had shadowed her life. Elena huddled on the bed, hands clamped over her ears, yet the words resonated inside her skull, patient and inexorable. They knew what she had done, taken the fragment, mapped the genome, named the unnameable. They approved, encouraged, waited. The air grew thick with the scent of damp stone and turned earth, as though the chapel ruins had migrated indoors. Somewhere in the chorus she heard approval for her curiosity, gratitude for the light she had shone upon their long vigil. She rocked slowly, eyes wide in the dark, the ancient German weaving through her thoughts like roots seeking soil. The plea never wavered: preserve the bloodline, keep it pure, come home. The house itself seemed to breathe with them, beams creaking in rhythm, floorboards flexing like lungs. Dawn was hours away, and the voices showed no sign of tiring, their patience infinite, their need absolute. Sleep came only in shallow drifts, broken by the relentless murmur of the voices that now seemed to rise from every corner of the room. Elena lay rigid under the heavy blankets, eyes fixed on the ceiling where shadows shifted like slow-moving clouds. At some point exhaustion pulled her under, and the darkness behind her lids thickened into something denser than mere absence of light. She found herself standing in the woods, snow ankle-deep and luminous under a sky bruised with stars. The trees parted ahead, forming a corridor that led toward the ruined chapel. Figures moved between the trunks, tall, slender shapes draped in pale gowns that caught the faint glow like cobwebs. As they turned toward her, faces emerged, women of varying ages, all bearing the same unmistakable features. Jaws protruded sharply, lips full and parted as if forever on the verge of speech, eyes large and luminous in sunken sockets. Their skin had a translucent quality, veins visible beneath like faint blue rivers. They drew closer without seeming to walk, gliding over the snow without leaving prints. Elena felt no cold, only a pressure in her chest as though the air itself had weight. The nearest figure reached out, fingers elongated and jointed strangely, brushing her cheek with a touch that burned like ice. Where contact lingered, her own skin tingled, and for an instant she saw her reflection superimposed on the woman's face, her features softening, lengthening, the chin beginning to thrust forward in subtle distortion. More gathered, circling slowly. Their faces blurred at the edges, melting into one another as if boundaries had grown porous. A younger sister's delicate nose flowed into an older one's heavy brow, lips overlapped and fused, creating momentary hybrids that flickered between individuals. They moved in perfect synchrony, hands raised in identical gestures of welcome, mouths shaping silent words she somehow understood: join us, become us, complete the circle. The melting intensified. Skin slid like wax under unseen heat, features pooling and reforming in endless recombination. One moment a sharp Habsburg profile dominated, the next it dissolved into something softer, almost childlike, then sharpened again into grotesque exaggeration. Eyes remained constant, dark, pleading, fixed on her with unbearable intensity. They pressed closer, bodies beginning to overlap, limbs intertwining until distinction vanished altogether. A single composite form emerged, towering and fluid, its face a churning mosaic of all the sisters at once. Elena tried to step back, but the snow held her feet like gentle hands. The voices were inside her now, no longer external, resonating in bone and blood. She felt her own face itch, a deep pulling sensation along the jawline, as though something beneath the skin sought new shape. The composite figure leaned in, its melting features stretching toward her like tendrils, inviting merger. Warmth spread through her chest, seductive and terrifying, promising an end to separation. She woke gasping, sheets tangled and damp with sweat. The room was pitch black, the voices momentarily stilled. Her hands flew to her face, tracing familiar contours with frantic relief, yet the sensation lingered, a phantom ache along the mandible, as if memory of change had taken root. Dawn light was still hours away, and the woods outside waited in perfect silence. Dawn crept in slowly, a pale grey seepage through the curtains that did nothing to warm the room. Elena had not slept again after the vision in the woods, her body rigid with exhaustion yet wired with dread. She forced herself downstairs, brewed coffee on the gas stove, and spread the journal across the table beside her laptop. The bone fragment remained in its vial, catching the weak light like a tiny accusation. She needed answers, rational, scientific ones, to anchor herself against the dissolving edges of the night. She began photographing pages, translating passages with a mixture of dictionary and memory. The text grew more fevered toward the end, shifting from genealogy to justification. The writer, identified only as Brother Anselm, confessor to the exiled sisters, described the inbreeding not as dynastic arrogance but as sacred obligation. The blood must remain undiluted, he insisted, so the ancestors could find purchase in the living. Each marriage within the circle was a stitch binding past to present, each child a vessel strengthened by concentration rather than weakened. Further entries detailed ceremonies held in the hidden chapel under new moons, candles of human fat, chalices filled with mingled blood, chants in Latin and older tongues meant to thin the veil. The sisters, born with the most pronounced deformities, were deemed holiest, their altered forms proof that the ritual worked, that the old emperors and empresses lingered close, guiding through dreams and whispers. When court scandal threatened exposure, the family fled deeper into the mountains, vowing eternal isolation to complete the work. Anselm wrote of a final rite, performed as Enlightenment rationalism encroached even on remote valleys. The two youngest sisters, barely flowered, jaws already locking speech, volunteered to be sealed alive within the chapel crypt. Not as punishment but culmination, their undiluted essence would anchor the ancestral chorus forever, allowing it to reach outward when the bloodline called. They entered willingly, the journal claimed, singing as the stones were laid. Their sacrifice ensured the voices would never fade, only wait for the right heir to hear and answer. Elena paused over a marginal sketch, a circle of interlocked hands, faces blurring into one continuous line, labeled *una anima in multis corporibus *, one soul in many bodies. The deliberate inbreeding had been alchemical, an attempt to forge a conduit dense enough for collective persistence. Deformities were sigils of success, the jaw's distortion a gateway widened by generational pressure. She cross-referenced dates against known Habsburg history. The flight aligned with purges after Joseph II's reforms, branches too visibly afflicted quietly erased from records. Whispers of a lost Tyrolean line had circulated among historians, dismissed as myth. Yet here was proof, in ink and bone and DNA. As she read, the house remained unnaturally quiet, no wind, no voices, only the soft tick of snow sliding from the roof. The silence felt watchful, approving her progress. She turned another page and found a genealogy extending forward, blank spaces left for future names. The last entry, dated 1918, noted the death of the final male heir and a prophecy. The line would return through a daughter of the outer world, drawn back when science itself unlocked the secret. Elena stared at her own reflection in the dark window, the prominent chin she had always disliked suddenly seeming less accidental. The journal lay open like a mouth waiting to speak her name. Elena's hands trembled as she closed the journal, the leather cover falling shut with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the empty house. She had traced the genealogy forward one last time, following the sparse entries that dwindled after the Great War, names growing fewer, births rarer, until the final male heir perished in the trenches and the line hung by a single fragile thread. The prophecy on the facing page was written in a different ink, bolder, as if added decades later. The blood would call its own back from the scattered world when the moment ripened, when knowledge itself became sharp enough to pierce the veil. She rose unsteadily and crossed to the tall mirror in the hall, an antique piece veiled in dust that she had avoided until now. Wiping the glass clear with her sleeve revealed her reflection more sharply than she wished. The face staring back was familiar yet suddenly strange, high forehead, dark eyes set a fraction too wide, and the chin that had always jutted more than she liked. In the cold morning light it looked less like a personal quirk and more like an echo, a softened imprint of the portraits lining the staircase, of the sketches in the journal, of the elongated profiles in the DNA readout. She opened her laptop again and pulled up her own genome file, the one she had sequenced years ago for a population study. Side by side with the chapel sample, the alignments began to overlap in ways that defied coincidence. Shared rare variants clustered along the same chromosomes, homozygous runs mirroring the ancient pattern but diluted, masked by generations of outcrossing. Her mitochondrial lineage matched exactly. Autosomal segments carried the telltale Habsburg markers, attenuated yet unmistakable. The inbreeding coefficient for the chapel remains was catastrophic, but hers showed faint scars of the same constriction, as if the knot had loosened only recently. The realization settled slowly, heavily, like snow accumulating on a branch until it bends. Her mother's vague stories of aristocratic displacement, the family photographs with faces turned away, the absence of any paternal history all aligned now into a single, inescapable pattern. She was the daughter of the outer world the prophecy had waited for, the one whose scientific training provided the key to name and summon what had been preserved in isolation. Elena stepped closer to the mirror, studying the subtle prominence along her jaw, the way her lower lip rested fuller than average. The features were mild, modern, acceptable, nothing like the grotesque exaggerations in the journal, yet they carried the same signature. The voices had known before she did, calling her by variations of old names because the blood recognized itself across centuries. She placed her palm against the cold glass, and for an instant the reflection seemed to lag, the eyes darkening with something older than her own gaze. The house remained silent, but the silence felt different now, expectant, satisfied, as though the long vigil had reached its turning point. Outside, the snow-laden branches of the forest pressed closer to the windows, and deep within the woods the ruined chapel waited, patient as stone. The lineage had found its continuation, drawn home by curiosity and inheritance and the irresistible gravity of undiluted blood.